Welcome viewers, you are about to hear a captivating tale written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. Don't forget to subscribe. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Curse of the Black Orchid. Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair by the window, a slender beam of sunlight cutting through the gloom of the room, its warmth momentarily dispelling the chill of the evening. The cluttered space of 221B Baker Street, filled with the musty scent of old books and faint traces of tobacco smoke, seemed almost as tired as the detective himself. His sharp eyes, however, remained as piercing as ever, scanning the letter in his hands with an intensity that suggested he could almost will the ink on the page to reveal its secrets. The letter was simple, yet strange. Its parchment bore the unmistakable seal of an old family, a symbol of faded grandeur. The handwriting was elegant but uneven, a telltale sign of the writer's nerves. It was unsigned, but the words contained a weight that made Holmes's pulse quicken. "Mr. Holmes," it began, "I write to you in dire straits. I fear that an ancient curse, long whispered about in my family, is soon to befall us. The Black Orchid, a symbol of wealth and misfortune, is in our possession once again. My father, Samuel Rowe, has recently come into its possession, and with it, the dreadful legacy that has claimed the lives of our forebears. I implore you to investigate." Holmes folded the letter, his brow furrowing with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. A curse? He had solved many cases in his career, but the notion of supernatural forces was anathema to his logical mind. He had once said, and often repeated, that when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Still, there was something about the letter that intrigued him. The notion of a family cursed by an object, an orchid no less, was something too peculiar to dismiss out of hand. He placed the letter down on the nearby table and leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest. His mind began to churn, the gears of deduction turning slowly at first, then with greater speed. A few moments passed before he rose from his chair and made his way to the fireplace, where a low fire crackled softly. As he reached for the bell pull, a sharp knock sounded on the door. He paused, glancing towards it, knowing it would be none other than his ever-faithful companion, Dr. John Watson. "Enter!" Holmes called, his voice as cool as always. The door creaked open, and Watson stepped into the room, his face alight with the glow of the setting sun. He removed his hat and coat, his demeanor slightly weary from the day's work. "Holmes, I trust you are not brooding over another one of your complex puzzles," Watson remarked, his voice carrying the familiar warmth of their long-standing friendship. Holmes smiled faintly, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Not brooding, Watson, merely contemplating a curious letter I've received. There are elements here that suggest a challenge of a different nature." Watson raised an eyebrow, stepping closer as Holmes handed him the letter. "A curse, you say? You've solved many a mystery in your day, but I dare say this one will be most unusual." Holmes allowed himself a small nod. "Indeed, a curse may be too fanciful an explanation, but the events described are unsettling. I think it best we take a trip to the estate of Samuel Rowe, the man who sent this letter. It seems we may be called upon to solve a mystery of both a more earthly and, perhaps, more peculiar nature." Watson's gaze flicked from the letter to Holmes, and he paused, concern flickering in his expression. "And what do you make of this Black Orchid? Is it really as dangerous as this letter suggests?" Holmes gave a nonchalant shrug, though his eyes were distant, already lost in thought. "A flower, Watson, no more dangerous than any other. But if it has been tied to a family curse, we may have to examine more than just the object itself. Curses are often nothing more than symbols of deeper truths, truths that may have been hidden for generations." Watson, always a realist, nodded slowly, his mind processing the possibilities. "Very well, Holmes. I shall prepare for our departure. But, as always, I must caution you. Some mysteries, some curses, are perhaps better left unsolved." Holmes turned sharply, his face a mask of calm determination. You, of all people, Watson, should know that a mystery cannot simply be ignored, no matter how peculiar it may seem. Let us see what awaits us at Rowe's estate. With that, the two men exchanged a final glance before Holmes retrieved his coat and scarf, his mind already racing ahead to the journey that awaited them. Watson, ever the loyal companion, followed close behind, his thoughts drifting to the strange letter that had so captured Holmes's attention. As they made their way out into the cool evening air, the clatter of the door behind them seemed to close off the ordinary world, leaving only the unknown, where shadows of doubt and fear awaited. It would not be long before Holmes would uncover the truth, whatever that may be. But until then, the air between them crackled with a sense of expectancy, as if the very night itself was holding its breath. The carriage rumbled steadily over the cobblestone road, the rhythmic clattering of the wheels echoing in the quiet night. Sherlock Holmes sat back, his sharp eyes never ceasing their scrutiny of the passing landscape, though his mind was already several steps ahead. His thoughts flickered between the enigmatic letter and the strange family that had drawn him to this remote estate. Dr. Watson, seated across from him, was less at ease. His fingers drummed lightly against his cane, the anticipation of a new case always bringing a sense of restlessness. "Holmes," he began, breaking the silence, "what are we to make of this Black Orchid? You seem strangely intent on unravelling this particular mystery." Holmes shifted slightly, his voice measured, yet tinged with a rare edge of curiosity. "Watson, some objects are more than mere things. They carry with them the weight of history, of secrets that have been buried beneath layers of time. The Black Orchid. If it indeed holds sway over this family, it is not merely a flower, but a symbol of something far darker." Watson nodded, though his expression betrayed his skepticism. "A symbol of what, exactly?" "That, Watson, remains to be seen. But I suspect that whatever curse it represents is nothing but the surface. We are dealing with something far more complex." Holmes leaned forward, his hands steepled before him, his mind's gears whirring. "What interests me is not the curse itself, but why it has resurfaced now, and why Samuel Rowe chose to send for me." The carriage turned sharply, and the large estate loomed ahead, bathed in the soft glow of gas lamps. The estate was sprawling, its dark silhouette stark against the cloudy sky, surrounded by tall iron gates that creaked in the wind. As they arrived, Holmes's eyes narrowed, and Watson felt the weight of the atmosphere pressing in on them. The coachman helped them disembark, and they were greeted by a tall man with a gaunt face, his eyes shadowed under the brim of a wide hat. He introduced himself as Mr. Langley, the family's steward, his tone formal but strained. "Gentlemen," he said with a slight bow, "you are expected. Please follow me." He gestured toward the large front doors of the house, and without another word, he led them inside. The interior of the Rowe estate was as grand as it was sombre. The high ceilings and polished wooden floors echoed with each step. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and fading perfume. Holmes's keen senses immediately picked up on the faint scent of something else. Perhaps dust, perhaps decay. A sense of neglect seemed to hang in the air, though the estate itself was immaculately furnished. Langley led them down a corridor lined with old portraits, their eyes seemingly following them as they walked. At the end of the hall, they were ushered into a sitting room where a woman was waiting. Her features were pale, almost ethereal, framed by dark, soft curls that seemed too perfect for the late hour. Her gaze shifted between them with an intensity that was almost unsettling. Holmes studied her in silence for a moment before stepping forward. "Miss Rowe, I presume?" he asked, his voice soft but deliberate. "Yes," she answered, her voice a cool whisper, betraying no hint of emotion. "I am Evelyn Rowe. Thank you for coming." Her gaze flickered momentarily to Watson before returning to Holmes. "I trust my father's request was clear?" Holmes gave a small nod. "Clear, but incomplete. I wish to understand the full nature of your family's troubles, Miss Rowe. It seems there are more layers to this situation than what appears on the surface. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, but she held her composure. Perhaps there are. But you will find, Mr. Holmes, that the truth is not always as simple as you may believe. Watson, ever the diplomat, interjected with a smile. I'm sure we will get to the heart of things soon enough, Miss Rowe. But perhaps you could begin by telling us about this Black Orchid your father mentioned. What makes it so special? Evelyn's lips parted, but for a moment no sound came forth. The room grew still, the only sound the soft crackling of the fireplace nearby. Her expression became distant, her eyes momentarily flicking to the window, as if lost in a memory. It is a family heirloom, she finally said, her tone flat, as though she were reciting words she had been forced to memorize. It has been passed down for generations. My father always spoke of it in hushed tones. He believed it had a power, though whether it was real or not, I cannot say. Holmes leaned in, his piercing gaze never leaving her face. And yet, your father believed it was the cause of the family's misfortunes. Evelyn nodded, the flicker of emotion gone as quickly as it had appeared. Yes, the Black Orchid has been tied to every tragedy that has befallen us. My grandfather, my great-grandfather, each of them met an untimely end, and each was in possession of the orchid. A family curse, Watson muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. He looked at Holmes, who was deep in thought. I see, Holmes said quietly. And now your father is dead. And the orchid, it seems, has gone missing. Evelyn's composure faltered for just a moment before she regained her poise. Yes, she whispered. The orchid was taken. After my father's death, it vanished without a trace. And now I fear that the curse is coming for me. Holmes stood up, his gaze sweeping the room with a deliberate intensity. Fear is a powerful motivator, Miss Rowe. But we shall not be guided by it. We will uncover the truth, piece by piece, until we understand what happened here. Evelyn's eyes softened slightly, but her expression remained guarded. I hope you are right, Mr. Holmes. I pray you are right. The night had settled in thick, and a quiet tension hung in the air, like the delicate weight of an unseen storm. Holmes and Watson followed Langley down the shadowed halls of the Rowe estate, the silence between them only broken by the soft shuffle of footsteps on the ornate carpets. The low light from the gas lamps cast faint pools of yellow against the dark wood of the furniture, and the air, thick with the smell of old books and dust, felt as though it were holding its breath. Evelyn had led them to a small parlour at the back of the house, away from the main corridors where the more formal rooms of the estate resided. This room, quieter and darker, seemed almost an afterthought. Its furnishings were sparse, the atmosphere muted, as though it had been left untouched for some time. There is no denying it, Holmes murmured as they entered, his voice barely audible, though his eyes scanned the room with an intensity that seemed to pierce the walls themselves. The house has an oppressive air about it, a strange sort of weight. Watson gave a small nod, but his gaze fell on a painting hanging above the mantelpiece. It depicted an older man, Rowe's father perhaps, dressed in fine clothes that seemed almost out of place for the current state of the estate. The portrait's dark, brooding expression only added to the unsettling feeling. Before Watson could comment, Langley, his expression grim, spoke up. This is where it happened, he said softly. I thought it best to show you. It is in this room that Mr. Rowe died. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly as he took in the details of the space. The room was set up as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. There was a fire crackling faintly in the hearth, the room's velvet curtains drawn, the furniture in its usual place. Yet something was amiss. The absence of Rowe's presence, the stark emptiness left behind by the death, was palpable. Evelyn, standing near the doorway, bit her lip nervously, her eyes darting between Holmes and the darkened corners of the room. She seemed unable to remain still, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. Mr. Rowe's body was found here, in this very chair, Langley continued, gesturing to a high-backed armchair by the fire. His voice trembled slightly, and his hand hovered over the back of the chair, as though reluctant to touch it. He appeared to have passed in his sleep, peacefully at first glance. But there was something about it. It didn't feel right. Holmes approached the chair slowly, his boots barely making a sound against the wooden floor. The firelight danced across his face, casting fleeting shadows that only added to the mystery. He placed his fingers lightly on the armrest, as if to gauge the space. Then, without warning, he bent down to examine the rug beneath it. Watson watched his friend closely, noting the concentration that had shifted onto Holmes's face. "What are you seeing, Holmes?" he asked quietly. Holmes straightened, his eyes alight with the first hint of a realization. "It is not the chair that concerns me, Watson. It is the floor." He motioned for Langley to step aside. "Come closer. You see these faint marks? They are not from any normal movement of a chair." Langley took a step forward, squinting at the rug beneath the chair. "I don't see anything." Holmes, however, could not have been clearer. "Look closely. These are scratches, not from a person sitting down or rising. No, these are the marks of something, or someone, being dragged. This floor has been disturbed recently." The steward's face paled, and he opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Holmes continued to study the floor with intense scrutiny, but something else caught his attention. A faint smell that lingered in the room. It was subtle, almost undetectable at first, but to Holmes, it was a clue as sharp as a knife. "Do you smell that?" he asked, his voice low and contemplative. Evelyn looked around nervously, her eyes wide. "Smell? I don't... What do you mean?" Holmes gave a small shake of his head, his nose twitching slightly as he stood up. "It's faint but unmistakable. A chemical odor. Not strong enough to be perfume, but something medicinal. It's been masked by the fire, but it's there nonetheless." Watson stepped closer, his own senses straining to detect the scent. At first it seemed insignificant, but the more he concentrated, the clearer it became. "It's chloroform, isn't it?" he asked, his tone cautious. Holmes turned slowly to face him, his eyes gleaming with an unspoken understanding. "Precisely. Whoever killed Samuel Rowe knew exactly what they were doing." Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. "No? You're suggesting my father was murdered?" Holmes nodded once, his voice steady. "I am. But there is more. I believe he was drugged, and then placed here, in this chair, to appear as if he had died peacefully in his sleep. This was no natural death." Langley seemed to struggle with the revelation, his hands shaking as he adjusted his collar. "But the letter, the curse," he began, his voice faltering. Holmes raised a hand, silencing him. "This is not the work of some supernatural force, Mr. Langley. The curse may have played its part, but only as a distraction. The real cause of Mr. Rowe's death lies within this room, and we are going to uncover it." Evelyn, still reeling from the revelation, took a small step back, her breath shallow. "But who could have done this? Why?" "That," Holmes said, his eyes narrowing slightly, "is what we must now discover." The house had taken on a different feeling since the discovery of Samuel Rowe's death. No longer merely an ancient home filled with silent portraits and faded grandeur, it now felt like a labyrinth of secrets, its walls heavy with questions that begged for answers. Holmes moved through the estate with a quiet intensity, his gaze taking in every detail, his mind connecting the smallest pieces of a puzzle that was becoming increasingly complex. Watson followed at a slightly slower pace, his eyes flicking between Holmes and the darkened corners of the house. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and Watson couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching them. The house seemed to shift around them, the silence broken only by the distant creak of wooden floorboards or the occasional rustle of wind against the windows. They had been given a full tour of the estate by Langley, And now, after their grim discovery in the parlour, Holmes had decided to begin the investigation in earnest. He had already instructed Langley to gather the house staff in the drawing room for questioning, and now he moved through the hallway, his footsteps purposeful, his eyes scanning the walls, the floors, the very air for anything that might suggest an answer. Watson, ever the skeptic but equally curious, remained close by, watching his friend with an expression of quiet admiration. "Holmes, you seem preoccupied," he remarked softly, his tone a mixture of concern and intrigue. "What is it that you're looking for? There's nothing more to be found in that room, is there?" Holmes paused, his back to Watson, his hands folded behind him. He turned his head slightly, casting a brief glance over his shoulder. "Not yet, Watson. But there are things you must learn to observe, the things that seem out of place. A single thread, overlooked, can unravel the entire fabric of a case. It is there, in those subtle details, that the truth lies." He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on an ornate cabinet in the hall. It was a large, imposing piece, its wood polished to a gleam, but Holmes's eyes narrowed as he studied it. He walked over to it, running his fingers lightly across the surface. "There," he said, his voice low but purposeful. Watson, confused, approached. "What is it, Holmes? A hidden compartment?" Holmes didn't answer immediately, instead lifting the edge of the cabinet's front panel, his brow furrowing. He moved with precision, a practiced hand at work. The wood creaked slightly as it shifted, and with a sharp click, the cabinet's false bottom revealed itself. Holmes's fingers slid under the panel, and within moments, a small folded piece of parchment was revealed. Watson watched in silence as Holmes unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the carefully written words. It was a letter, written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. As Holmes read, his eyes darkened with understanding. "This was meant to be destroyed," he muttered, holding the letter up so Watson could read. It was addressed to Samuel Rowe from someone unknown, the ink slightly smudged, but still legible. The letter spoke of family debts, secret deals, and a mysterious figure, someone who had been watching the Rowe family for years. The last sentence of the letter was the most telling. "The Black Orchid is the key. You know what must be done before it's too late." "This changes things," Holmes murmured, folding the letter carefully and slipping it into his coat pocket. "There is more at play here than we first believed. The orchid, the debts. It seems this family's curse is not supernatural at all, but a financial one, cloaked in the guise of mystery." Watson, frowning, shook his head. "But who would go to such lengths? To make a murder look like a natural death? To hide a letter in a cabinet? What does it all mean?" Holmes met Watson's gaze, his eyes sharp and focused. "It means someone is very careful, someone who knows the value of the Black Orchid and the leverage it provides. This is not a case of simple greed, Watson. It is a web of lies, a game of power, and someone, perhaps several people, are playing it to their advantage." The sound of footsteps approaching from the drawing room broke the moment of contemplation, and Holmes tucked the letter away quickly, turning towards the sound. It was Langley, his expression tight and his hands clasped nervously behind his back. "The staff is gathered, Mr. Holmes," Langley said quietly, his voice betraying his anxiety. "What would you have us do now?" Holmes's gaze shifted toward Watson and then back to Langley. "We'll begin with questions, of course. But first, I want to see if there is any other information hidden in this house. Clues are often closer than you think." Without waiting for a response, Holmes turned on his heel and made his way towards the stairs. Watson followed, though he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The more they uncovered, the more tangled the case seemed to become. As they reached the second floor, Holmes stopped abruptly outside a room near the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. He hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. Inside was the Rowe family library, a room filled with dark wood shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, each shelf crammed with dusty volumes. The scent of aged paper and leather was thick in the air, and the soft, flickering light from a single candle illuminated the vast space. Holmes's eyes swept over the room with practiced ease, but his gaze was drawn to a book lying open on the desk in the centre of the room. Watson stepped closer, intrigued. "What is it, Holmes?" Holmes approached the desk slowly, his fingers brushing over the yellowed pages. It was a botanical book, its pages well worn, filled with illustrations of rare flowers and plants. But it wasn't the images that drew Holmes's attention. It was the annotations in the margins, written in a hand he recognized from the letter they had found earlier. "This book," Holmes muttered, "was not meant for casual reading. It was a guide to the Black Orchid." The atmosphere in the room thickened, as if the very air had shifted. Holmes stood upright, turning to Watson with a new intensity in his eyes. "I believe we are closer to the truth than we thought, Watson. We must find out more about the orchid, its history, its power, and who stands to benefit from its possession." The staff gathered in the drawing room were an eclectic mix, each one a piece of the puzzle Holmes had yet to solve. Langley, standing slightly apart, had summoned them with the urgency of a man who knew the gravity of the situation. But now, as Holmes and Watson stood before them, the tension in the room was palpable, thick with the unspoken fear of what might happen next. The murmurs of the servants and staff quieted as Holmes entered, his presence commanding, his sharp eyes scanning the group with unsettling precision. Evelyn stood off to the side, her face unreadable, but her eyes flickered with something, perhaps nervousness, perhaps regret, as she watched the proceedings. Holmes's gaze swept over the room, his mind already sifting through each person before him. The first to be questioned was Mrs. Havisham, the elderly housekeeper, whose hands were clasped tightly in front of her. Her thin face was lined with age, her eyes tired but alert. She had been with the Rowe family for decades, a fixture in the house, and Holmes could sense that she knew more than she was willing to admit. "Mrs. Havisham," Holmes began, his voice steady but full of quiet authority, "you have worked for the Rowe family for many years. Tell me, what was your relationship with Mr. Rowe? Was he in good health recently? And did he ever speak of the Black Orchid?" Mrs. Havisham's lips trembled slightly, but she kept her composure. "Mr. Rowe was a good man, sir," she said, her voice soft, though tinged with a hint of unease. "He had his eccentricities, as one might expect of someone so wealthy, but his health had been failing for some time. He didn't speak much of the orchid, not since his father passed away. It's a cursed thing, Mr. Holmes." Holmes raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp. "A curse? Tell me, do you believe it to be more than superstition?" The housekeeper hesitated, her fingers twisting in front of her. "I don't know what to believe, sir. All I know is that every time the orchid was brought into the house, something bad would happen. The last time Mr. Rowe was in a terrible accident, and his father died shortly after the orchid was given to him. I think it's true. The curse, I mean." Holmes listened carefully, noting the discomfort in her words. She was clearly frightened, but there was something else there, something more than just superstition. As the housekeeper's eyes darted nervously toward the door, Holmes made a mental note to return to her later. Next, he turned his attention to Thomas, the butler. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed, with a stern, almost aloof demeanour. His face was impassive, but his hands twitched slightly as Holmes addressed him. "Mr. Thomas," Holmes began, his voice colder this time, "you were present in the house at the time of Mr. Rowe's death, I understand. What can you tell me about the night he passed?" Thomas remained silent for a moment, his gaze flicking briefly to Evelyn before returning to Holmes. "I did not see Mr. Rowe that evening, sir," he said, his voice smooth but lacking warmth. "I was attending to my duties in the servants' quarters. It was only when Langley found the body that I was called." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "You were not concerned for Mr. Rowe's well-being, then?" Thomas stiffened. "I do my job, sir. Mr. Rowe had his own way of living. I've never interfered with his private matters." Watson, who had been silent until then, spoke up. And the Black Orchid. Have you seen it? Did Mr. Rowe ever speak of it to you? Thomas's face remained impassive, but Holmes could see the faintest flicker of something, fear perhaps, in his eyes. I've seen the orchid, of course. It's impossible not to. But Mr. Rowe never mentioned it to me directly. Only in passing, as a family heirloom. Nothing more. Holmes stared at him for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. You claim to have no interest in the orchid, Mr. Thomas. But it seems unlikely that a man in your position would remain entirely unaffected by such a powerful object. I suggest you think carefully before speaking again. The tension in the room escalated, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken accusations. Thomas's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing further. Holmes made a mental note to revisit him later, as something in his demeanour didn't sit right. But for now, he turned his attention to the final member of the household staff, the young maid, Clara. Clara was visibly nervous, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. She was new to the Rowe estate, having started only a few months ago, and her nervousness was palpable. Clara, Holmes said, his voice gentle but firm. Tell me about the night Mr. Rowe died. Where were you, and did you see anything unusual? The maid swallowed, her throat working as she fought to control her anxiety. I was in the kitchen, sir. I didn't see anything unusual. I heard noises from the study, but I thought it was just Mr. Rowe working late. Did you hear anything else? Holmes pressed, his gaze unwavering. Clara hesitated, wringing her hands. I did hear a faint sound, like something was being moved around. But it was late, and I didn't think much of it at the time. I never thought... She faltered, her voice cracking as her eyes filled with tears. I never thought Mr. Rowe was in any danger. I didn't know. Evelyn, who had been silent until then, stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara, you don't have to... Holmes raised a hand to silence her, his eyes never leaving the maid. Clara, did you see anyone leave Mr. Rowe's study that night? Someone who might have been responsible for... He hesitated just slightly, as if weighing the importance of his next words. For what happened to him? Clara's face turned ashen, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes widened in terror, and Holmes could see that she was on the verge of collapsing under the weight of her fear. The room held its collective breath. The tension in the drawing room seemed to hang in the air like an invisible weight, thick and suffocating. Holmes stood still for a moment, his mind working like a finely tuned instrument, turning over the details of the interviews they had just conducted. Each word, each gesture had been carefully noted. Yet there were inconsistencies, contradictions that didn't quite fit. A flicker in Thomas's eyes, an unnecessary hesitation from Mrs. Havisham, the nervousness of Clara. All of these clues, though small, suggested a much deeper mystery. The maid, Clara, was still visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the chair, avoiding Holmes's gaze. The soft crackling of the fire seemed louder in the silence that followed her last, aborted attempt to speak. Holmes did not press her further. Instead, he turned his attention back to Langley, who had been quietly observing from the corner. You, Mr. Langley, Holmes said, his voice firm but measured. You've been unusually quiet. I'm beginning to think that there is more you know than you have shared. Langley stiffened, his gaze darting toward the door as if he might make a swift exit, but he remained rooted to the spot. I've told you everything I know, Mr. Holmes, he replied, his voice betraying a hint of unease. I was loyal to Mr. Rowe. I've nothing to hide. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. Loyalty is a fine quality, Mr. Langley, but it often clouds the mind. I suspect you have witnessed things that are more than mere coincidences. Langley opened his mouth to protest, but Holmes held up a hand. Your movements, Mr. Langley. You were one of the last people to see Mr. Rowe alive, were you not? And yet, you didn't mention that your visit to his study coincided with the time of his death. Langley's expression faltered for the briefest moment before he recovered, his back straightening. I did visit him, but I didn't see anything unusual. Just a few words exchanged. That's all. Holmes remained silent for a long moment, his gaze piercing, and then, in a voice that sent a shiver down the spine, he spoke again. You see, Mr. Langley, I don't believe you. Your version of events doesn't add up. You are too calm, too controlled for someone who has just witnessed a death. It suggests that you knew something beforehand. Watson, who had been standing off to the side, stepped forward, his brow furrowing in concern. Holmes, what are you suggesting? Holmes turned toward Watson, his voice quiet but laden with intent. I believe that Mr. Langley, in his loyalty to the family, has been covering something up. He may not have been the killer himself, but he has concealed the truth, perhaps even to protect someone else. Langley's face reddened, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. You have no proof of that, Mr. Holmes. No proof at all. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the thrill of discovery, a slight smile curling at the corners of his lips. Proof? Perhaps not yet. But there are contradictions in your story, Mr. Langley. For one, you spoke of visiting Mr. Rowe and exchanging only a few words. And yet, when I asked about the Black Orchid, your reaction was most peculiar. Langley's posture stiffened, and his eyes flickered away from Holmes, an involuntary motion that did not escape the detective's notice. Holmes took a step closer, the scent of tobacco and aged leather filling the air around them. You didn't answer my question properly earlier. You know more about the orchid than you've let on, and I suspect you've seen it with your own eyes recently. Langley, trapped now, glanced at the others in the room, his lips quivering, before he spoke again, his voice strained. It's not what you think. It's not what any of you think. Holmes tilted his head, his gaze never wavering. Then explain it to me, Mr. Langley. What are you hiding? Before Langley could respond, Clara's voice, weak and fearful, broke the tension in the room. Please, Mr. Holmes, you don't know what you're asking. You don't understand. Her voice faltered as tears welled up in her eyes. Please, don't make me say it. It's not what you think. I didn't mean to get involved in any of this. I just wanted to keep my job. Holmes's attention shifted from Langley to Clara, and he could see the raw fear in her eyes. Something about her reaction was different now. It wasn't just the fear of being accused. It was the fear of something far darker. He took a step toward her, his voice soft, coaxing. Clara, what do you know? What are you afraid of? Clara's shoulders trembled, and she lowered her head, her face obscured by her dishevelled hair. I didn't mean to. I didn't know it would happen this way. She paused, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Mr. Rowe, he wasn't the only one who wanted the orchid. There was someone else. Someone who came to see him the night he died. Someone who said... They said they'd stop at nothing to get it. Holmes leaned in, his interest piqued. Who, Clara? Who came to see Mr. Rowe? Clara shook her head, as though the memory itself was too painful to bear. I can't tell you. A flicker of realization passed through Holmes's eyes. He turned back to Langley, whose face had gone ashen, his body trembling slightly now. Langley, Holmes said, his voice hardening. I think we both know who that someone was. Don't we? For a long moment, Langley stood frozen, his silence more damning than any words could have been. The tension in the room crackled like electricity, every person present holding their breath as the truth began to unfold. The room fell into a heavy silence after Clara's words. Her voice, barely above a whisper, had cast a chill over the gathered group. Holmes's mind raced, the disparate pieces of the puzzle clicking together in a way that had eluded him until now. He took a slow breath, letting the silence hang for a moment longer before speaking, his voice calm, but laden with purpose. You've given us much to consider, Clara, he said, his eyes never leaving her trembling form. But it seems that we are still missing key elements to this puzzle. You said someone else came to see Mr. Rowe the night he died. Someone who wanted the Black Orchid. Tell me more. Who was it? Clara shook her head vehemently, her hands wringing the hem of her dress. I don't know, Mr. Holmes. I only saw the figure in the dark. He was wearing a cloak, and his face was hidden. But I overheard them arguing, Mr. Rowe and the man. I couldn't make out all the words, but I heard enough to know that it wasn't just about the orchid. It was about power, control. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp, his mind already forming connections. Control, he echoed softly. Yes, that fits. The orchid is not merely an heirloom, it is a symbol of something much more. Perhaps, as I suspected, this is not about a curse. It is about greed, an attempt to consolidate power under the guise of a family legacy. Watson, who had been listening intently, spoke up, his voice laced with caution. But if this is about control, why disguise it as a curse? Why not simply take the orchid and be done with it? Holmes paused, considering his words carefully. The question was valid, but the answer was not immediately obvious. Because, Watson, the power of the Black Orchid is not just in its possession, it is in its story. To claim the orchid without acknowledging the curse would be to sever the very reason it holds power. This isn't just about the orchid itself, it is about maintaining the myth. The myth ensures that the legacy continues, that the holders of the orchid are seen as the rightful owners of this twisted power. He turned his gaze back to Clara, whose face had paled even further. Did you hear anything else? Anything about the man? The one who wanted the orchid? Clara's lips parted, but her voice faltered. She seemed to be struggling with her own fear, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Finally, she spoke, her words coming out in a rush. The man. He said he was coming for what was his. He said he'd been waiting for this moment for years. And then, he told Mr. Rowe that if he didn't hand it over, there would be consequences. That's when I heard the noise. The sound like something heavy being knocked over. It was loud, but it stopped just as quickly. Holmes straightened, his mind churning with the information. Consequences, he repeated, the word hanging in the air like a portent. This man was not only interested in the orchid, he was willing to threaten Mr. Rowe's life to ensure his claim. Evelyn, who had been standing silently by the fire, finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly. But who would want the orchid so badly? My father. He was a man of wealth, yes, but who would go to such lengths to steal an object that seemed to bring nothing but tragedy? Holmes's eyes narrowed as he turned toward Evelyn. That, Miss Rowe, is the question we must answer. Someone has used the curse to manipulate your family, to claim ownership of the orchid under the guise of an inheritance. This person, whoever he is, has made a calculated move, preying on your family's beliefs and fears. He began to pace the room, his mind racing, piecing together the scattered clues with growing clarity. The orchid itself is the key, not just as an object of wealth, but as a symbol of control over the Rowe family. The curse, whether real or not, has served to distract and divide. The one who sought Mr. Rowe's death, he was playing a much deeper game. Watson, observing Holmes's movement with quiet understanding, spoke up again, the pieces slowly coming together for him as well. You believe that someone has been waiting for the right moment to strike, that this isn't a sudden act of desperation, but the culmination of something long planned. Holmes stopped pacing and turned toward Watson, his expression intense. Exactly. There has been a long game played here. The orchid is the pawn, but the true power lies in the hands of someone who understands its significance. Someone who knew the history of the Rowe family. Someone who could manipulate them into believing in the curse. Someone who could have been hiding in plain sight. Evelyn's face shifted, her eyes wide with realization. Do you mean... Holmes nodded slowly. Yes. I believe the person who murdered your father, Miss Rowe, is someone who had access to your family's secrets. Someone who knew your father's every move, every weakness. The room seemed to hold its breath as Holmes's words settled over the group like a heavy mist. The pieces were all falling into place now, and the truth was becoming painfully clear. It was not just a matter of who wanted the orchid. It was a matter of who had been playing the long game, waiting for the right moment to take control. Holmes turned to face Langley once more, his gaze unwavering. Mr. Langley, I believe it is time for you to tell me the truth. You have been more involved in this than you've let on. You knew your place in this scheme. You knew exactly who wanted the orchid and why. Langley's face was ashen, his lips tight with the effort of holding back his words. No, Mr. Holmes. You don't understand, he stammered, his voice cracking. I was only following orders. I never wanted any of this to happen. Holmes stepped closer, his tone lowering, almost conspiratorial. Who ordered you, Langley? Who has been pulling the strings from behind the scenes? For a moment, Langley seemed to falter, his resolve breaking. He took a shaky breath, then looked up at Holmes, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. The silence in the room was suffocating. Holmes stood in front of Langley, the air between them thick with anticipation. Langley's face, once a mask of composure, was now contorted with fear. His hands, usually steady, were trembling as they rested at his sides. The room seemed to close in on him, as though the very walls were pressing him into confessing his guilt. Holmes could see it, the moment when a man knew his secrets were about to be exposed. Langley was broken, his once confident demeanour shattered under the weight of Holmes's scrutiny. Mr. Langley, Holmes said, his voice cool, yet tinged with an undeniable edge. You have been playing both sides of this game, haven't you? You knew the history of the Black Orchid, knew its power, and you used that knowledge to manipulate everyone around you. But there is something more, something that ties you to this death. The question is not whether you are guilty, but to what extent. Langley's breath hitched, his eyes flicking nervously to the others in the room. His lips parted as though he were about to speak, but no words came. Holmes stepped forward, closing the distance between them. I've watched you, Langley, Holmes continued, his voice measured but intense. You had the motive. You had the opportunity. You even had the means. The question is, who was your accomplice? Langley's gaze faltered, his chest rising and falling rapidly as the weight of the situation crashed down on him. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Holmes narrowed his eyes. Didn't mean for it? What exactly was it that you were hoping to accomplish, Mr. Langley? To inherit the Black Orchid? To claim it as your own? Or was this something deeper, more dangerous? Langley's face twisted with anguish, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. It was never supposed to end like this, he muttered again, the words repeating like a broken mantra. I didn't want anyone to die. It was supposed to be just a simple transaction. But when my father got involved... Evelyn, who had been standing motionless by the fire, stepped forward suddenly, her voice sharp with realization. Your father, she said quietly. You were working with your father, weren't you, Langley? That's the one who wanted the orchid. Langley's face drained of colour, and for a moment, it seemed as though the floor might give way beneath him. He looked up at Evelyn, his expression a mixture of shame and regret. It was never supposed to go this far, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He was the one pulling the strings. My father. He knew about the orchid, about its power. He wanted it for himself, wanted to control the family legacy. Holmes raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. Your father, Langley, the late Mr. Rowe's rival. Langley nodded slowly, his gaze falling to the floor. Yes. He and Mr. Rowe had been at odds for years, competing over land, money, influence. But the orchid, it was always the prize, the ultimate symbol of control. My father believed that if he could take possession of it, he could bring the Rowe family to its knees. and he thought that, by having me work in the household, I could ensure that it came to him. Holmes paced the room slowly, allowing Langley's words to sink in. It all made sense now. The rivalry, the power struggle, the manipulation of the Black Orchid, it had all been a calculated game. Langley had been the pawn, and his father had orchestrated the whole thing. The orchid had been their tool, their weapon. But the deadly turn it had taken, Mr. Rowe's death, the staged curse, was never part of the plan. That much was clear. "You didn't want it to go this far," Holmes repeated, his voice cold. "But your actions have already sealed your fate. By aiding your father, you have become complicit in a crime that cost a man his life." Langley's hands trembled as he reached up to touch his forehead, his face a portrait of misery. "I never wanted to kill him," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "I thought we could convince him to give it up, that he'd see reason, but he wouldn't. And then my father, he didn't leave me a choice. He wanted the orchid more than anything." Evelyn stepped forward now, her voice rising with a mix of disbelief and fury. "So, you were part of this, Langley? You were willing to kill my father over some flower?" Her words were bitter, laced with a pain that cut deep. Langley winced as though struck. "I didn't," he faltered, his voice breaking. "I didn't kill him. It was supposed to be my father. He arranged everything. But when Rowe died, it wasn't supposed to look like murder. It was supposed to be simple, just a switch. A few subtle changes to make it look natural." He paused, looking around the room at the faces of those who had once trusted him. "But I couldn't stop it. My father, he had everything planned. He told me what to do, where to go, what to say. I was just following orders." Watson stepped forward now, his voice firm but compassionate. "You didn't plan the murder, but you were complicit in it. You allowed it to happen, and for that, you are just as responsible as the man who struck the final blow." Langley's shoulders slumped as if all the weight of his actions had suddenly pressed down upon him, crushing him under the guilt. "I didn't know what else to do. I thought if I helped my father we could have it all. The orchid, the power, everything." Holmes, his eyes narrowing in contemplation, took a step back. "And what of your father now, Langley? Do you expect me to believe he isn't still involved in this? That he didn't somehow help arrange your position here, in the heart of this family's demise?" Langley's silence was all the answer Holmes needed. The house seemed quieter now, almost unnaturally so. The final confrontation had drawn to a close, and with it, the weight of secrets long buried had finally come to light. The fire in the drawing room still crackled softly, but its warmth felt distant, as if the room itself had become too cold to bear. Holmes stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes scanning the darkened estate. The light from the street lamps outside cast long shadows on the walls, adding to the stillness that had settled over everything. Watson stood beside him, his expression a mixture of relief and contemplation. The case was solved, but the resolution, for all its clarity, had brought with it a sense of uneasy finality. The events that had transpired were far from simple, and the truth had revealed itself not with a dramatic flourish, but in the quiet, suffocating way of a truth long suppressed. Watson nodded slowly, his thoughts mirroring Holmes's. "It seems that all of this, the Black Orchid, the supposed curse, it was nothing more than a smokescreen, a way to hide the true nature of the rivalry between the Rowe family and Langley's father. But the murder, Holmes, that was the result of a scheme gone too far." Watson, ever the pragmatist, gave a quiet sigh. "Perhaps. But then, no one can predict the lengths to which people will go when they feel their world is slipping from their grasp." Evelyn, who had been standing near the fireplace in quiet contemplation, suddenly spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "What happens now?" she asked, her eyes searching Holmes's face. What happens to my family? To this house? To the orchid? Evelyn's lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but found the words eluding her. She had lost much: her father, the illusion of family unity, and the sense of safety that came with knowing where the power lay. But now, all of that had been stripped away. She was left to confront the aftermath, and though the pain was raw, she seemed to understand that the only way forward was to face it head-on. "I don't know if I can," she murmured, her voice distant. "This house, this place, it holds so many memories. But now they're all tainted. The orchid, my father. I don't know if I can ever truly escape what's happened here." Holmes regarded her silently for a moment, his expression softening with an understanding that was rare for him. "You need not escape it, Miss Rowe. You must simply learn to live with it. The past is an inescapable part of us, but it does not define us. You have the power to choose what happens next, and that, I believe, is the most important thing of all." Watson, who had been silently observing, stepped forward. "Holmes is right. The past may shape us, but it does not bind us. You have your own life to live now. The rest is behind you." Evelyn nodded slowly, her eyes distant, but filled with a quiet resolve. "I will try," she said, almost to herself. "I will try to move forward." Holmes gave a small nod of approval, his eyes moving toward the door. "Then I shall leave you to it. I am certain that you, Miss Rowe, will find your own way. It is not for me to decide your future, only to point you in the right direction." As Holmes turned to leave, Watson gave one last glance at Evelyn, who now seemed less like the broken woman from earlier, and more like someone who had come to terms with her own path. It was a subtle shift, but it was there. Outside, the night had deepened, the sky now a blanket of inky black with only the faintest trace of stars peeking through. The streets of London, alive with movement just hours ago, now seemed deserted, quiet, as though the city itself had exhaled a long, weary breath. Holmes, stepping into the carriage, offered a final word. "Another case closed, Watson," he said, his voice carrying the familiar, detached tone that suggested no real emotion in the matter. "But not all mysteries are as easily solved as this one." Watson settled across from him, his expression thoughtful. "Indeed, Holmes. But I dare say this one will be remembered for a long time."